Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years. Pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. So this is the third conversation with Theo, Wildcroft, and Becky, Aten, and this week we are talking about neuroqueering. This was possibly the most giggly interview I've done in a long time, which is a direct reflection of our topic. Not to spoil anything, but we get weird in the best way. And it is incredibly heartening to me when we get to give folks in the yoga world permission to go against this very sterile and rigid culture that is found mostly unintentionally in our spaces. This is the last episode in this series, and I'm kind of sad about it, to be honest. These were the most fun interviews to record. So if you want some more context on yoga and neurodiversity, please go back and listen to the other two episodes with Becky, Aten, Theo, Wildcroft, and Jess Glennie. And a quick note before we begin. If you would do me a solid and like, subscribe, or follow the podcast from wherever you're listening, I would be so grateful. That signals to the AI algorithm overlords that you like me, and they should show this podcast to more people like you. Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to remind you that your business could become a sponsor of this podcast. If you have a product or service that yoga professionals might want to know about, click the sponsor details in the show notes. We have community sponsors for people who are in smaller businesses so that people can get to know about you and your work. And honestly, I love that for us. Now, let's get into the conversation about neuroqueering with Becky and Theo. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Okay, so I have two friends back on the podcast, Becky Aten and Theo Wildcroft. Did I get it right? Okay, let's just start with the pronunciation because I asked Becky to confirm how to pronounce her name and she said, well, there's no right way to do it. And then I had a minor panic attack because I'm always trying to get things right. So today we're going to talk about autism and neuroqueering. Will you two introduce yourselves and tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Becky. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I'm a yoga facilitator. I have a project called Yoga for Neurodiversity that primarily is intended to bring awareness to and create space for neurodivergent folks to be able to, experience yoga in ways that suit our nervous systems. That's mostly the hat I'm wearing for our conversation today.
And Theo.
So I'm Theo Wildcroft. My pronouns are variable, but I will answer to most of them because I'm more interested in what you think my pronouns should be. And that's another the thing that we can talk about in a minute. But I am primarily these days an academic and a researcher, but also I've kind of taught and practiced yoga on and off for kind of 20 years. So I also teach and train a lot of yoga teachers and write books about yoga and so on. And I also happen to be dual diagnosis autistic ADHD, at least so far.
You're just going to collect more letters? Is that the thing?
I'm trying. We're in a conversation with the GP at the moment. We're seeing which one I would like to collect next.
You sound like a yoga person because we're always collecting letters too, like another certificate, another whatever.
It's great.
Okay, so the last time the two of you were on the podcast, we brought up the concept of neuroqueering, and then we were all like, we got to talk about this again.
Yeah.
So Can we dive into that topic first? Like, will you do some term definition for us again? What does that mean? What are we talking about today? And how does that how does that relate to yoga?
So if I start by doing the more kind of academic and theory piece, it really, it really starts from the idea of queer theory and queer politics. When you start to go beyond the idea of kind of access and inclusion to thinking about, well, what does queerness offer to the world as a way of navigating the world and as a way of being in it? Like, what's specific to us that doesn't involve us kind of being accepted as quote unquote just as good as non-queer people, right? So within queer theory, you have this idea that starts to build that there are important aspects to being queer. There are kind of definitional aspects to it that are important and valuable in the world, and therefore that the idea of queerness can be something that is celebrated and affirmed in and of itself. And queer at that point also is an incredibly inclusive term, right? It by definition refuses to define identities on the basis of who you choose to sleep with or who you might, how you might kind of want to sleep with or whatever that might be. It gets us kind of beyond that kind of alphabet politics of L and G and B and T into maybe there's something more that we have in common here, which is a different way of being in the world. Now, there's various ways in which that links to neurodivergence as an aspect of the world and a way of being in the world and as theory. And partly it comes from the very simple fact that if you're neurodivergent, you're more likely to have some kind of a queer identity. So there is an overlap there. There's also the growing idea from within amongst neurodivergent communities that we might just conceive of sexuality and gender in very different ways to the mainstream anyway. So like our way of being queer is different. So there's a kind of idea in which neurodivergence and queerness automatically overlaps. There's the fact that queerness is different if you're neurodivergent. And then there's the idea that neurodivergence is a form of queering, as in it fulfills some of the same possibilities and qualities in the world that queerness does. So therefore, some people start to talk about neuroqueering. So kind of what does it mean to reclaim neurodivergence as a different way of being in the world, and what does that give us and bring us? Have I got everything, Becky? Did I miss anything?
That was a great history, and I'll just distill into, I guess, a sentence.
Yes, please.
So when we use the term neuroqueering, we're looking at it as in like neurological queerness and also queer as in, disrupting binaries and norms like cultural norms when it comes to who we love, how we identify, our gender, our sexuality. And so it's really a simultaneous disruption of both of those things of neurocognitive functioning and queering gender and sexuality that come together in this lovely term, neuroqueering, which just for the record, I wrote all the names down of the folks that are credited with kind of conceptualizing this and coining the term. So this is from Nick Walker's book, Neuroqueer Heresies. I'll just, in case you're curious what that looks like. So it was Nick Walker, Athena, Lynn Michaels, Dylan, and Remy Urgo, who I think it was like around 2014, kind of came up with this concept and put it out into like social media spaces, and it's taken off from there.
So, okay, I love talking to you. I adore it. Because even as I sit in myself, I'm always like, oh, I'm other from this conversation. But even always within the first 2 minutes, I'm like, y'all are so inclusive because I feel welcome in this space. Like I feel welcome.
Like, are you a weirdo? Yes, then you're one of us.
Oh, great, because I totally am. Perfect.
Well,
It's lovely.
yeah, and I actually in Nick Walker's book, they go into like this whole idea that anybody can engage in neuroqueering as a practice, regardless of how we're born. We can choose to practice, and this is where yoga comes in, which I think yoga is such a great complement to neuroqueering
Mm.
practice. We can choose to practice in ways that reject some of the harmful norms, the fix-it kind of mentality that some people approach yoga with and say, yeah, like we were talking about before we started recording.
And
I know, I want you to go further because I think that's such
well,
an important topic.
I definitely think as well that like if even if you look at the kind of prehistory of yoga, you know, so much of that incredible diversity of philosophy and practice that you have within pre-modern yoga is about changing the way you relate to the world, right? And a lot of it makes you into, you know, for want of a better term, a weirdo, right? It makes you the kind of person who meditates for 18 hours a day or sits in a cave and doesn't want to see anybody, or like it's different. It's what does it mean to not take the human as normal and to explore the possibilities of what it means to be human. And therefore, there is something inherently kind of neuroqueering about a lot of that stuff, right? Um, I think where the problem comes in a lot of mainstream yoga is A, still assuming that normal exists, and that normal is something that we want to aspire to, and B, assuming that everyone starts from the same place, right? So we all experience the world this way, and we're looking to experience the world that way. Like some of us are tripping most of the time. Like that's just the way our brains work. And I don't actually need an hour of meditation to get to that place, right? Like my brain, I don't need like huge amounts of self-reflection. It's not particularly useful for me. It's something I can spend hours doing all on my own. Like a lot of kind of neurodivergent people, I find a lot of the kind of more mainstream yoga and meditation really inaccessible because it's starting from a point where I'm not even there, right? I'm elsewhere entirely. And this isn't about being more or less advanced. There's no spectrums in that sense. There's no hierarchies involved in this. It's just, you know, human beings are weirder than you know, right? And let's start by celebrating that initial weirdness and trying to understand how would it be to be different in the world, and how can we there's the name will come back to me, but because it's right at the forefront of my brain, but there's a couple of philosophers who talk about the radical act of letting be. Like, can you allow other people to be radically different from yourself and still find common ground? And can you be radically different to yourself? Like, can you embrace your own weirdness and strangeness about what it means to be a sentient piece of meat in the world? That's just insane. Who's
I mean,
worrying
I feel
about who's winning the traitors? Or do you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
what?
yeah.
How?
Like, okay, so I just want to say, I feel like this is an essentially anti-capitalist
Oh yeah,
theory that we're applying to yoga, right? Because, like,
yeah,
as you were talking, my brain's going, well, how the hell did we get Ashtanga then? Or how did we get,
mm,
like the really rigid routines where everybody's body has to, or Iyengar,
yeah.
where everybody's body, typically is expected to be doing the same thing at the same angles. And
Yeah.
then I was like, oh, because it's easier to sell. A model
And
that is repeatable is easier to sell to more people.
also group practice. Like if you're teaching
Yeah.
everyone side by side and you're in the room with them, they're like trying to teach them all the same thing is really important, right? So I very much know that there's a way of teaching yoga that doesn't do that. You know, I champion it. I teach people how to do it. But like, you know, the success of Jivana's work, for example,
Yeah.
Haven's work,
Yeah.
is based on the fact that so many yoga teachers get to the end of a teacher training and go, how am I supposed to cope with diversity of students
Yeah.
in my class? And he's teaching really important but really simple principles, right? Where he's like, no, maybe one of your students could be sitting down and one could be standing up and one could be lying down, and you could teach them the same thing. Like there are ways of doing it, right? But we don't, as a rule, often teach yoga teachers to do that in initial yoga teacher training. So we teach them to teach to a group, and a group is always going to be about this mythical, normal, average that doesn't exist, basically.
Yeah. So, okay, my thought here is because this is a thought that's been in my brain actually quite a bit recently, like culturally speaking. So, if we're applying this theory to yoga teachers who are out there,
Yeah.
it's actually that we're not teaching them what to teach, we're teaching them how to see and how to think.
Yes.
that's
Yeah,
like a whole different principle, right? Like,
and
because
how
we
to
don't
relate,
do
right?
that.
No, and
Like,
how to relate to people, how to hold space, how to, yeah, how to come together, how to, allow people to be different, how to help people find their own way to what thriving looks like for them.
yeah,
And you mentioned, the whole anti-capitalist thing. I think that there's always been a very clear anti-capitalist message in queering in its purest sense, with the idea that essentially queerness is either a failure or a refusal to be productive to in a capitalist sense. And before we began, I was waving Halberstam's book on the queer art of failure, which is not about neuroqueering, but is about queering more generally. And what I love about this book is the idea that queerness is inherently a brokenness, that it is that we are either broken by or refusing to be productive in that kind of capitalist sense, because we're refusing to do all the normal things of get the mortgage and the 2.5 kids and the husband or the wife, and and the white picket fence and so on. And the idea is that we are within the confines or within the worldview of that system. We are inherently other. We are inherently broken. And what if we were to embrace the art of failure? What if that was to be our rallying cry, the thing that brings us together is our weirdness, our kind of, campness, our kind of naffness, if that's a word that Americans know. It's a kind of queer, more of a queer British
no.
word,
Cringe.
kind of
Oh,
cringe.
okay.
Yeah, our
Okay.
cringiness, our, like, the fact that we might be still interested in My Little Pony at 47 or whatever, like, you know what I mean? All of this stuff,
Yeah.
right? And that's something that is also really common and prevalent in neurodivergence because, again, either through an inability to understand kind of social and cultural rules or just a refusal to play the game, right? Which is really common, particularly for autistic people, but across neurodivergence in general, I think. I mean, there's the whole ADHD aesthetic, which I don't really go for, is the whole kind of massive amounts of neon and pink that you see sometimes. Some kind of AFA people with ADHD are like, wow, that is a choice. That is a way of dressing. That's a way of being in the world, right? But from the autistic point of view, there's the idea of comfort clothes and wearing the same thing every day because it's comfortable, and like so many ways in which we engage in the world that are at odds with capitalism in the way that makes us feel broken. So just as an example, often neurodivergent people don't play well in office environments because we can be fantastically good at the job. We can be, we can be very, very productive in that sense, but we don't perform all of the social stuff that goes with it, right? I remember the last time I worked in an office, it was relatively kind of relaxed, but still my boss was really, really had an ongoing issue with my refusal to wear shoes in the office. And he kept telling me it was a health and safety issue. And I was like, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. I am not comfortable wearing shoes indoors, and I'm not going to wear shoes in the office. And like, although he was a very nice, very inclusive guy, like you could see it just messing with his head on a level. So, like it's all of those ways in which we are broken from the point of view of capitalism, I think.
How do we, okay, I'm curious on both of y'all's experience in the yoga and wellness space. And then
Mm.
I'm curious your thoughts on how we start to shift the conversation, because I think that conversations like this, even if we just give somebody a little something to think about, all of a sudden something clicks and you'll see people go, oh my gosh, I
Yeah.
really don't have to do all those things that I was told I had to do. Like I can think
Yeah.
differently. So I'm curious, both your current experience and past experience in the yoga and wellness space, and then how you think we can start breadcrumbing this to people so they follow us like, little bunnies.
I, I'll just start by saying, um, and I think I said this before we started recording, like I feel like I live in a bubble sometimes. I think I've intentionally chosen um, to seek out spaces that cue for like this is going to be a space where probably a lot of neurodivergent people are going to show up. Like I just went to a yoga for hypermobility class
Mm.
here in town. And and even like in the introduction to like the class, the teacher made a comment about, I think most of us in here are neurodivergent, so
Yeah.
you don't have to put your mat in a straight line, like facing me. You could, so I was at an angle and it was very encouraged to, if you needed to leave the room, if you needed to divert from whatever was being offered, it wasn't going to be considered disruption. We were talking during the class, having conversation, asking questions. Um, so it's just like, just a very different environment, I think, than what most people think of when they go to a yoga studio class. Um, and and I've offered this example. It's a very silly, very superficial example of how I've incorporated neuroqueering into my own work one-on-one with clients. Um, but there's a practice, a chair yoga practice. Um, I think Rodrigo Souza, I've seen him teach it, called apple picking, where you pretend you're picking apples off of a tree and putting them in a basket. And I have a client, we're both adults, grown up people. Um, we love bats, and we decided we were gonna, instead of picking apples, we were gonna pet bats. And so we were reaching
So
out
cool.
and petting bats as they were flying by, imagining. And then we gave them names, and they were queer bats, of course. Quirkus was the name that we came up with for the they them bat. And it was just like, and it was a really fun, kind of joyful experience in the context of a one-on-one yoga session. Um, but that's like neuroqueering in a nutshell,
Mm.
like just taking something mainstream and making it weirder.
I love that. That's honestly, I'm like, oh, I was born this way.
I,
I'm making
I
things weirder all the time.
I'm going to agree with Becky that I think that I don't spend a lot of time in environments that aren't accessible to me for obvious reasons. So, but it is true that there's a lot of the kind of more mainstream offerings that I just do find inaccessible and in lots of interesting ways. And generally, it's when they're oriented to a mythical kind of like commonality where it's like we all do this or we all know this or we all feel nice when we do this and that's when it starts to get kind of under my thumb, in different ways. I can give one example, however, that crept upon me, which was I was at a kind of festival once, and somebody I knew actually was doing a session specifically for kind of AFAB people on kind of honoring kind of female bodies, for want of a better term, and particularly she was talking about breasts specifically, and and I don't normally find myself in those kinds of spaces because as a queer woman, I pass for straight in some ways in a lot of those spaces, and that makes me really uncomfortable, right? And she started saying that as women, which is like that's the first red flag, right? As women, we all know that generally our experiences of our breasts is of them kind of being pulled on, kind of being messed with and grabbed, either by the men in our lives or the children that we have. And I'm like, okay, now as a childless bisexual woman, you need better boyfriends. Like this is like what is your problem? No, my kind of sexual partners of any gender do not generally, manhandle, for better, to use an apt term, my breast tissue. But it was interesting that it wasn't in that moment. I didn't just experience it as a kind of a funny thing. I immediately felt there was a chilling for me. I felt like a circle had been drawn, and everyone was nodding, and I was an imposter in that space immediately. And when she moved that group kind of from outside of the canvas structure into the canvas structure, I just quietly didn't go in with them. I just walked away. And that is, so often the reality of a lack of inclusion is that you won't know who you're leaving behind, right?
Mm.
You're just going to make people feel less than human, less than female, less than whatever else it might be, right? when you make these kinds of statements, or you start out from these universalized experiences. And I think that generally the biggest issue I have is with yoga teachers taking personal experience and universalizing it, right? And yoga teachers are often very neurodivergent in very specific ways, right? So they're often, I know it's not necessarily, it's an associated thing, but most of us are hypermobile. Most of us are AFAB. Most of us are a little bit, highly strung. Most of us like to control the spaces that we're in, right? Most of us are all these different things. So many yoga teachers actually have a lot of undiagnosed queerness in that sense of not being like the mainstream. And what they do is they tend to kind of fix that as the norm so that then everybody in the class knows what it's like to, or is able to. And of course we can all, like, just really simple things like the assumption that everyone can sit on the floor when they come into a yoga class, right? Because obviously, we all sit on the floor. Whenever I go and I'm sitting in on teacher trainings and so on, like I sit on the floor, like I'm sitting on the floor right now, but I know I'm weird, right? Most yoga teachers are like, well, obviously, why would we need chairs? We're all yoga people here. We can sit on the floor for 6 hours at a time, right? And maybe we'll put a little cushion and rub butts, but that's about it. But the other thing I wanted to say is that a lot of my kind of formative training, for want of a better term, in yoga was when I was teaching profoundly disabled children and young people in respite scenarios. So these are and special schools and things like that. So I did a lot of small group and one-to-one work with kids in those spaces. And a lot of those kids were very, very profoundly different from the mainstream to extents, I think, that most people never even come across. We're talking about, at the very least, the majority of the young people I was working with were nonverbal, for example. Like that was just a given. Some of them were very kind of medically compromised. Some of them had kind of significant issues with impulse control or emotional regulation, or they were very sensory seeking or very sensory avoidant. Like the gap, their queerness to the world was extreme in very diverse and different ways. And each and every time I find myself in a room with them, I had to find the place where I, and yoga could meet, right? And it was always a challenge. And it was a challenge like that allowed me to grow each and every time I went into that space, right? And I had students, like I had one student who was obsessed with interesting smells. So, but she would also tend to put things in her mouth. So I figured out that I could get kind of scent on roller, the rollers, like scent roller kind of things. So they're relatively safe. And I was using ones that were like massage oils. So they were probably safe if she did ingest them, rather than kind of perfume oils as such. And I would roll one on one hand and she would smell that. And then I'd roll another on the other hand and she'd smell that. And we'd do that for like maybe 5 minutes before maybe we'd do a stretch together, right? And then we'd do some more sensory work. And 90% of the session together was sensory work, and maybe with the occasional posture thrown in, right? But what we're doing in that space is we're connecting to the sensorium, to her senses. We're connecting her to her breath. We're, allowing her to self-regulate. We're doing all of the things that I know yoga can do. But I know that your average yoga teacher would have come in that room and go, there's no yoga happening here. Right?
Yeah, I think part of so as you were speaking, I wrote one word very large, and it was morality, because I think one of the things that happens in the yoga space is we attach morality to particular things that we do. Yeah. There's just there's like a moral goodness that we want to attach to the things that we're doing. And one of my goals is for us to divest ourselves from that desire to make particular movements or practices or things morally good.
Or being late, or being able to sit still, or being able to close your eyes in Shavasana, or whatever else it might be. Yeah. Yeah,
the message isn't just that you're somehow queer or different. It's that we've attached morality to the opposite of what it is that you do. Because as you were telling the story about the kids you were working with, I can hear a yoga teacher's brain working, going, that's amazing work, but I do the real yoga in the real classes. You know what I mean? Like we put morality to it looking like,
Yeah.
30 people on PVC mats doing some sort of particular asana.
Yeah.
And I think some of that neuroqueering that has to happen is us taking morality out of our
Yeah.
experiences of what we're
Can I
providing.
can I give just one example that will really
Yeah.
annoy those people? I had a young man I worked with now. I'm working as part as a team, right? So there's other people working with this young man before I met this young man, but they'd already been doing work with him to get him to a certain point. When he started at the respite center, he was coming in restraints with a helmet on his soft helmet on his head because he had no impulse control and he would essentially engage in self-harm activities pretty much constantly, right? I worked with him at the point where he no longer had the restraints and he no longer had the helmet and he could engage, with care with people around just to look after him a little bit to make sure that he could be one-to-one with me. After about 6 or 9 months of working with him, I realized that what he was signing to me is that he couldn't rest and he wanted to rest. I thought he just wanted to go to bed. That's weird to begin with. He was just kept saying bed, and I was like, "You can go to bed if you want to. I don't know why you're here." I got that child and I got to a point where he was meditating. So don't tell me that what we were doing wasn't real yoga. Now, in order for him to meditate, he surrounded himself with cushions. So he was like a little mountain of cushions with his head sticking out the top. And I found an LED changing candle and I put it in front of his nose. And he kept his focus on that LED candle for 10, 15 minutes without moving. This is a child with no impulse control.
Oh.
So there's real yoga and there's real yoga.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's even like techniques. There's a word for that kind of meditation.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm like, this child is meditating.
Yeah.
We were like, no, he's meditating. He's not just sitting quietly and relaxing, he is meditating. So, yeah, like, I don't know. Whereas you can take a room full of 30 people all jumping up and down at the same time, and you don't know if they're thinking about breakfast or dinner or what the affair they're going to have later, or
Right.
you don't know anything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Becky.
Oh, I can't remember what the original question was that you
It
were
doesn't
asking,
matter.
but I was just going to add in there's this term that I came across in the through this program called Cultural Autism Studies at Yale. I don't know if Theo, if you've heard of this.
Sounds amazing.
But they have
No.
these get-togethers online where it's like autistic people who come together and talk about their experiences of reality and how that relates to theoretical physics. And there's a lot of like it's both academic and then there's just, community members who just come because they want to nerd out and it's cool.
Mm.
Um, and so one of the facilitators is a physicist. Her name is Dawn Prince Hughes. Wrote about, she calls it neuroholographic reality, which is a
Mm.
way of describing how a lot of neurodivergent people experience the world in this way of being interconnected to our environment in a way that that well, I know now that explains a lot about my experiences growing up and the disconnect that I had with like socially with my peers, the challenges that I had in different environments. Um, but I think it's, as it was with everything, it's a spectrum. And so some people really truly do feel like they can have an emotional connection to inanimate objects, for example.
God, yeah.
And and I think what's really interesting when you look at yoga practice and the context of like, Eastern philosophy and religion and thought around, how everything's a being. We're all
Mm.
are and even the kosha model, for example. I think for
Hmm.
autistic and other neurodivergent people who are experiencing yoga, it's more likely that we're going to come in as a brand new practitioner already with awareness of these layers of energy, layers of being that I think in hindsight now I'm looking back, like most people have to start from the sensory world and work their way
Mm.
inward.
Mm.
Whereas I think a lot of other neurodivergent people are already feeling things that they don't have names for, have never been given vocabulary to talk about. But now in a yoga practice, it's, actually these practices are cultivating that awareness and guiding us to it in a way that allows us to, um, not feel othered, not feel like we don't belong. But now we've found a place where we can actually, um, have that connection and celebrate the way that we are without feeling as weird.
I
I don't
think
know
you're
Yeah.
absolutely right.
how
I think
that
you're absolutely right.
lands, if that makes sense. But
I think that, I mean, I know that any of I've had a number of spiritual teachers over the years, and every one of them was like, we don't need to teach you to do the weird stuff. We don't need to teach you to connect to energies. We don't need to teach you to, to do any of that. What we need to remind you to do is to occasionally like wash up, go for a walk. Like it's coming back, it's being here. That's the problem. And on a purely kind of physiological level, like the levels of interoception in some autistic bodies are really quite high, which is weird because at the same time we often are unable to give language to those experiences. So we can feel, but we can't necessarily talk about it, or we're feeling some things more than others, and we can't figure out where in the body feelings are located. That inner orchestra can be really quite loud, I think, and difficult for us to navigate as a result. So turning up that interoception can actually be more of an issue for us. On the other hand, most autistic people I know again, we're generalizing what is an inherently diverse group, but quite often there's a massive issue with proprioception. Like we don't know where we are in space. Like,
Yeah.
so you can sometimes ask someone who's autistic to do the most kind of refined and specific kind of meditation practices, and there'll be no issue there. But you ask them to know whether their right arm is vertical or not, and they have no idea where they are in space, right? So there is also that. I think Becky's right. It means we come into the practice from weird angles. And certainly, like for me, for example, the most difficult thing I have ever done in a yoga class as a student has always been pranayama, because my breath does not want to begin a pranayama practice and it will give me a panic attack. I mean, literally, the whole like breathe in for 4, hold for 3, etc. No, 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 no. My body doesn't want to do that. But on the other hand, if you want me to slow my breathing or make it deeper or whatever, like I can do some quite complex things with it. But the beginner stuff is the stuff that often I can't do, right? So it depends how wedded the teacher is to the forms and the protocols of teaching yoga, often is one of the biggest issues, right? If they can see through to what the intention of the practice really is trying to do and find a different way to get there, then, we're off and we're flying a lot of the time.
Okay, so can we talk about the intersection of neurodiversity, neuroqueering, and trauma? Because we talked
That's
about
the
it a little
circle.
bit before we hit record. But I mean, you're not the first, second, or fifth person I've talked to about yoga who's been like, we all came here because we had traumatic histories.
Yeah.
And it's funny, but also I had somebody, who's chatting with me about it who was like, no, you can actually parse out the trauma based on the particular style of yoga you've chosen. Hey,
Not a
guess where
surprise.
everybody who had really, really particular parents went to? Iyengar. Who had athletic injury? Ashtanga. Who wanted to belong to the cool club? Bikram. Like, you just kind of are like, and this person went further. He was like, drug addicts are in Kundalini. I mean, it was really I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
But he said the one overlapping thing was that we all had trauma of some kind. Now, does that mean we just have an entire culture of people who both think differently and are trying to act like they don't?
Yes.
Great.
I
Okay,
mean, the
we're
short
done.
answer is yes, right?
Right.
And that is a problem, right? That is a real issue.
Right.
But also, I think that there's different kinds of trauma we could be talking about. Like that, it is a lot of kind of the researchers into neurodivergence will basically say that there's no such thing as an untraumatized neurodivergent person. Like just living in the world is traumatic for us. So there's a couple of things going on. Living in the world is traumatic for us. We are victimized at incredibly high rates, like shockingly high rates. People are going to be listening to this thinking, oh, it's a few percent more, or it's a double. No, 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 no. Like majority depends on the stats you look at, but like the majority of us will be victimized in some ways because we are inherently more vulnerable, or we're socially ostracized, or we have a different way of being in the world, and so on. So that is kind of part of it. I think that when it comes to yoga, the other thing that's important to note is the sheer amount of medical trauma, because neurodivergence also involves different kinds
Yes.
of bodies. It generally involves um, uh, always being the weird one, not just in every other environment, but in medical environments as well. So you go to doctors with what for a neurodivergent person is really common, like POTS or mast cell or hypermobility or whatever else it might be, and they go, well, you can't possibly be in the 1% of people that have this because that's really rare. And we're like, no, 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 you're going to find that I tick all of these boxes
Mm.
because these things are much more common in neurodivergent populations, because it's not just our nervous systems that are different, it's everything that's different, right? So we're kind of in a situation a lot of the time similar to a lot of kind of black communities, for example, where the doctors aren't looking for sickle cell, or that, what I mean, there's all of these things that will be more common in certain populations than in others. And because doctors are used to looking for particular kinds of averages, they're looking for Occam's razor, right? What's the most normal thing, right? You get told, oh, well, it's probably just anxiety. Like, yeah, we, many of us are anxious, but we're often anxious because of the treatment we've had in medical situations. And a number of us, for example, will be hypersensitive to different kinds of medications and different kinds of treatments. I was talking to my therapist a little while ago, and I asked her, I said, does every autistic person just have a shelf full of medication that just hasn't worked? And she went, oh God, yeah. She's like, I'm half the time, I'm down the chemist, down at the pharmacy with another load. Like, yeah, this one didn't work, and this one didn't work, and this one didn't work, and this one didn't work, right? So, I mean, there is this whole thing, therefore, about neurodivergent people coming to quote unquote alternative treatments, or coming to alternative health environments of one kind or another, both carrying this suspicion of mainstream medical environments and also a whole lot of baggage around what it means to be in a therapeutic relationship, right? So yoga teachers should also be aware of that, right? Your neuroqueer students are going to be traumatized not just by what's happened to them, but by their experiences with both health, wellness, and the medical establishment in all forms.
Um, and the statistic, just FYI, there's a lot of them out there, but there is one that suggests that 85% of neurodivergent folks have gone through some kind of complex trauma related to all of those things that Theo mentioned, as well as bullying is a big
Yeah,
deal,
massive.
for all ages. Um, and there's also a huge overlap between being neurodivergent and queer. There was a study that suggested if you are non-binary, trans, like any other gender expansive in any other way, you don't identify as a gender you were assigned at birth, you're 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic specifically than cisgender folks. And
Yeah,
so that doesn't mean that you're diagnosed. Um, and having complex trauma doesn't mean you've got a diagnosis of PTSD. And so I think just understanding for yoga teachers, when you're serving a group of students, that there's going to be people in there who who don't know that they're
yeah,
living in a traumatized body,
yeah,
who don't know that part of that it might be due to neurodivergence, or at least an artifact of growing up and living in a world that's not designed for our nervous system. Um, and so, like, and I've gone through like many different varieties of like trauma-informed yoga trainings that say various things, but ultimately, I for me anyway, holding space, um, because I can't, there's no possible way that we could ever imagine all of the things that people have experienced, all the things that will trigger folks. Um, so just trying to create a space where there isn't any sense of hierarchy, where bodily autonomy is like the number one
Mm.
um, like principle that that you're instilling, and not just saying it once, but over and over and over again, reminding people, that they always have a choice. They can
And
always,
that's the point. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yes. So,
I was I'm thinking about that story you were telling Theo about being in a class. I think you called it a class for female bodies, where
Yeah.
the teacher was talking about, breast sensation. And my
Yeah.
brain's like, first of all, who's bringing that up in class? Like, what do you mean? Like, that's a weird thing to say, even in that environment.
Yeah.
But then on top of it, I was like, I don't think, and then I'm relating to myself and how I teach and how I teach others to teach, going, I'm teaching people to ask questions and to provide spaces for their students to reflect about their own experience.
Yeah.
Like that's
That's the difference.
that's just I was like, that's such a weird way to frame something about sensation of a particular part of the body. Like, can you feel
Yeah.
your gluteus muscles? Remember the last time somebody smacked you on your rear? Like that's a weird thing to say. And I'm just like, oh, maybe that's the subtle difference in how we want people to shift in teaching. Ask more questions, allow people to reflect, and do less direct, like, here's the story of me and my Uncle Samuel going to,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
all had Uncle Samuel, you know what I mean? Like who's teaching that way? How do
But
we
I also,
stop them?
I mean, in this case, it was kind of a preliminary. The whole point is this was her scene setting. So she was scene setting for a workshop on celebrating and reclaiming positive sensation in the body. So what she was trying to do, was find common ground in we all have experiences of our bodies essentially being touched against our will, or even by people that we love and care for, right? Which I'm like, I kind of see what you're trying to do, but no, the questioning is the place to start. But the questioning doesn't work if you don't have a mindset that really wants to not just accept but celebrate difference and diversity and weirdness.
Yeah.
That's the neuroqueerness thing. Unless you actually believe that there are so many ways to be in the world, right? Like there are so many ways to be human, and that life as it expresses it through not just human beings but any being is constantly trying to find a way to be, right? Like you look at, like, I'm not going to go to moss because I know it's Becky's thing, but like you look at the way trees grow. Trees are incredible, right? Like the trees that we think are beautiful are the ones that have had the most trauma and had the most, like, they're the ones
Yeah.
that are slightly twisted, or a branch is gone and they've kind of grown over that way, or they've grown the other way. Like we were in Savanac Forest, local to us, recently, and there were two trees that were had grown so closely together, and their trunks had twisted together as they'd grown. And we look at things like that and we're like, wow, this is amazing. Isn't it incredible how nature will always find a way to thrive in any circumstance? And then we look at human beings and they go, your third metatarsal is out of alignment. Like the fuck? Like our bodies also, and not just our bodies, but our brains, our nervous systems, everything else with it, is constantly finding ways to be. And some of those ways to be are going to be really unusual. And can we celebrate that? Like the history, if you look at certainly the modern history, for example, of elite sport, the thing that's fascinating is what you start to see is an increasing diversity of bodies. Have you seen that? There's diagrams of the average body. Like 50 years ago, your average athletic body kind of looked roughly the same, and now it's like, the runners are like the runners and the shot putters, and the bodies are so diverse and so different, right? And it's like when it comes to kind of long distance running, for example, there's like it's not just Kenya. There's like one particular tribe in Kenya with one particular genetic history, which produces all of the best marathon runners in the world, right? Like elite sports can embrace difference and diversity, but in yoga we're like, no, everyone has to be able to put their front thigh completely horizontal in warrior one. Like, what are we doing here? We need to separate out aesthetic commonality, which is a form of eugenics. And we need to throw that out and start to embrace the wild diversity of ways of being. Like Becky, you were talking about the picking apples thing. This is a thing I've always taught as well. Like, I love the picking apples kind of game to play with, because it's all about how do you do the thing? How do you, like, how many different ways can you reach out? And can you reach out behind you and before you? And at what point do you start to topple over? And at what point are you kind of reaching out past your kind of comfort zone? And like, these are the kind of experiments and things we want to be exploring in class. How many different ways can you do triangle pose, rather than this is the way Mr. Iyengar did it in 1976 and therefore no one can ever change it. Like it's insane.
Yeah, and I did a workshop. It needs a little work. I workshopped a workshop on neuroqueering yoga, but one of the kind of the main messages was the importance of feeling okay with questioning traditions, because of so much of and I grew up with religious trauma, and I was definitely taught that questioning was bad, was dangerous, and I know that message is also just cultural, regardless of whether you grew up religious. But exactly, like if you start to look critically at some of the longstanding traditions, regardless of how much you respect the lineage, you will start to recognize ways, that we've been, well, of course, colonization has impacted, how we interpreted all of those teachings, but that's where I think neuroqueering can really lend a lot to making yoga more inclusive, is by looking more critically and questioning traditions. And then when we see something that is causing harm, which lots of traditions do, then we can start to look at how we can bend or adapt or create options and choices around how we're practicing so that it's not causing harm.
I think you're right, and I think like it is like not universal, but there's the common autistic experience of being the one student that asks why, right? Like at every stage, and that I think a lot of us have a lot of kind of trauma around that in terms of schooling trauma and education trauma, right? Is that we didn't understand why we weren't allowed to ask why at various points, and we keep asking why because that's what we do, right? There's something about particularly autistic brains that often we need to understand before we can get our head around, in order to get our head around something before we do it. So if you're like, just do the thing, like, or the autistic kids or the autistic students are going to be the ones who go, no, I can't do the thing until I understand why we're doing the thing, right? So that's something we bring, that's a different kind of rigidity that we bring into any kind of an educational space, right? But it's a really useful tool, because if a student is saying to you, but why? Like, that's not a point at which you shut that student down. That is the point at which you throw your class plan out of the window and you say, okay, let's just gather around and talk about this for a moment, because maybe there is a good reason. Right? My first teacher trainings were quite relatively rigid in some interesting ways, because it was an Anya based teaching. So we'd always say, students would ask, like, generally speaking, in standing, have your feet hip distance apart, right? And I thought that was really interesting because, in Ashtanga, the feet are together. And that's interesting. Why do the Ashtanga people do it this way and the Anshara people that way? And I started to play with it in my own practice and with my students to be like, how is the practice different if we always do it with the feet together, if we do sun salutations with the feet together? And how is it different if they're apart? And a lot of us found, understandably, that with the feet hip distance apart, there was a difference in the center of gravity. So feet together was kind of better for dynamic movement, but if you slowed the practice down, you wanted the feet kind of hip distance apart. And from there, I started to go, well, okay, like the student asks, then what I started to do is go, okay, everyone stop. Everyone stop. I want you to stand with your feet together, stand with them apart, explore both of them. Now let's do a sun salutation. Let's see how it feels. Let's come back at the end. Let's do a couple different ways. Come back at the end and see what works for who and why, right? So that we're crowdsourcing that together. We're holding space for that kind of inquiry. there is nothing in the history of yoga that suggests that that isn't a reputable or sensible way of working. Like anything that we think of as group instruction, alignment, all of that stuff that we think of as traditional is less than 100 years old.
Okay, this is where I find, oh, I'm so glad we got here, because how do people's brains reconcile the purity, morality, and traditionalism that we very often espouse in the yoga space with the opportunity to teach in a way that gives people freedom to move based on what they need? Because I see people's brains glitch out, like in these conversations, like their brains get really, but I can't do that because it's tradition. That we hide
No,
behind
it's
that
not.
word, right? Like we
No,
really
it's
hide.
not.
Okay.
It's not.
I
What do
was
you mean
just
by
gonna say
tradition?
it's not.
It's not.
What do you say to the people who declare, yes, it
It's
is.
just not true. It's just not true. As from an academic point of view, it's just not true. Prior to, prior to the 20th century, there isn't a massive amount of evidence of group practice at all. Like most of the really traditional texts on yoga start by saying, find yourself a space well away from other people and practice your yoga, right? Like, so we're not even doing group instruction. All of this push through your tailbone and do this and do that and do the other, all of that kind of stuff. All of that is an artifact of teachers being in group instruction spaces in which poor Mr. Iyengar, bless him, or whoever it is being asked 50 times a class, what am I supposed to be doing with my big left toe? Right? And he goes, well, do this. And then all of that stuff starts to get codified into, well, in Iyengar, we always do this, right? So we're ritualizing all of that stuff. And most of that ritualization is really, really recent. Just as, people talk about adjustment and physical touch being so important in a yoga class. And I like safe touch in a yoga class, really important. It's also really important to note that, again, prior to the 20th century, there is no evidence of physical touch in yoga. There's just not. We don't do it. There's no adjustments, none of that. So all of this, well, it's traditional to. No, it's not. It just isn't. Not only that, those traditions, those pedagogies are born out of a particular place and time. And that place and time was subject to a lot of colonial trauma. It's all coming about in the kind of, early 20th century as India is in the process of becoming independent. A lot of it is a lot of the pedagogies being used come from regressive school practices and school systems, corporal punishment, etc., etc., etc. Some of it is actually just an excuse for sexual harassment, as we know. Like the histories of pedagogy in yoga are imported from lots of really dodgy sources at the start of the 20th century. There's nothing ancient about any of it. Sorry.
I hear them screaming out there.
Yeah, I know. None of it is real. Sorry.
I wish I had learned most of this in my 200-hour teacher training.
I know.
I think I was introduced to 3 yoga texts. And I didn't know that if you want to look at traditions of yoga, there's this lovely cleansing tradition. And I guess trigger warning, I'm going to talk about genitals here.
Yeah.
But you put a
Yeah.
pipe in your butthole.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And you walk waist deep
up.
into a river, you suck the water in your butthole and you squirt it out your penis.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's also a whole tradition of yoga ukranti, which is yogic suicide, which are methods for ritually cleansing the body so that when you commit suicide, you won't incur karmic debt and you'll be able to pop off the wheel of existence. Yeah. There's all sorts of shit under the name of yoga. Doesn't mean to say it's all sacrosanct. Like, it is a diverse set of practices, philosophies. This is like 4,000 years of the philosophies and practices of an entire continent, people.
Yeah.
There is never going to be one right way to do any of it.
Yeah. I think, okay, so before we end up, because I want y'all to both have a final say, I want to say, because the overwhelming majority of people who are practitioners and teachers in the yoga space are cisgender, heterosexual, white women. And there is a really unique history of good girl syndrome here. And we have just pulled that into the yoga space I mean, we can't even have color any freaking more here. Like, it's got to be white walls and tan floor. Like, we can't have anything. It's
Yeah.
as pure, as moral, as good as possible.
That's clean. Clean.
Yes.
Everything has to be
And
clean.
so if that's you and you're listening, I just want to say I love you. And it's okay if you're wrong and if you change your mind. It's okay.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
nothing that doesn't say anything about you. And there's an advantage to people who are neurodiverse, who are, because you already know your brain works differently. Like,
We
it's
already know we're broken and weird.
yeah.
We've got a head start.
All our neurotypical people, let's catch up. Like,
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
some of the
Yeah.
things you can do, like just like find ways to make things a little bit weird for yourself, like in really manageable small ways. Like, can
Yes.
you try putting the mats in a circle rather than straight lines once? Can you try, maybe wearing those kind of tie-dye funky colored leggings to class rather than having everything completely white? Like what we are really good at, like all yoga people are really good at, is self-reflection. So reflect on yourself, turn that gaze inwards and say, how am I allowing myself to be weird and different? And where am I not acknowledging that I have weird assumptions? Like, where do these assumptions come from? That we all have to do this in a particular way, or we all have to stand in a particular way, or whatever. And no one's saying throw all of that out overnight. We're saying, like, can you start to examine those assumptions one by one by one? And can you celebrate your difficult students? Because that's what neuroqueering is really about. Like, when you've got a student who's really difficult. I had a student once who was like heavily ADHD. She knew she was heavily ADHD. Like, on a regular basis, partway through class, in the middle of a posture, she would pose one of those questions that takes 15 minutes to answer, right? And I would always look at her and take a breath in, and she'd go, I'm being in trouble again, aren't I? And I'd be like, yeah, and that's cool. She knew, I knew, and I was like, okay, I can answer that question, but I'm going to leave it until we finish this sequence because everyone's standing on one leg. like celebrate the difficult students and start to ask yourself what they're bringing you, I think.
Yeah, I don't really know what else to add other than, just to reiterate, I think we're like people pleasing and perfectionism, those are really common responses to complex trauma. And
Yes.
and that's, so if it's a struggle to let
Yeah.
go of tradition and rigidity, just to give yourself grace to know why that is because you've been conditioned. I've been, I'll just speak for myself here and not project my experience onto everybody. I've been conditioned to believe and to assign that value judgment that creates that moral and spiritual and physical high ground um, that I have had to little by little, start to uh, mow down, or whatever word you want to use. Like, I've had to bring myself down, 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 um, because otherwise, like, what I'm trying to offer is not accessible to anyone else, and it's not serving me either. So,
Mm.
so letting go of that rigidity, examining hierarchies, seeing if you can expand your perspective beyond that binary thinking that's so ingrained in our culture, and just looking for the joy of that, like, moment of liberation when you try something weird and it feels kind of good and other people get into it. Like, I have seen this happen in group spaces, and there's a ripple effect, and it's really
Mm.
amazing when you
Mm.
do something different and then everybody else wants to try it, and you find out, like, we're all having a good time now and nothing bad happened. We broke tradition, we
Yeah.
broke form, we did something
Yeah.
radical, and like the yoga gods didn't strike us down.
No.
They're still here.
The lightning did not arrive.
Yeah. So
I love that takeaway because I think it's like, have fun. My experience is that the minute you start having fun, like, you'll have fun a little bit and then you'll have fun a little bit more. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, nothing matters now. Do whatever I want. And that moment is so great. Like, I want
Yeah.
that for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Okay. Will you both tell everybody listening where they can find you so they can be obsessed with you and your work now?
Well, as ever, mine is easy because I'm the only Theo Wildcroft on the planet. I keep saying this. At some point, someone will set up some
You
kind
do.
of AI avatar, and I'll be stuffed. But until that happens, like, you can find me on things. If you want to keep up with what I'm doing, the easiest ways to do that is via my Substack. Because once a week I will put out something weird and wonderful and strange. Some of it on free and some of it paid, but you get a good sense of what's going on, and there's a nice archive of all sorts of things going on there. Yeah, that's it depends when this is going out. I'm doing a yoga nidra course, but that's coming up quite soon, so I may or may not have taught that. It might be too late. I'm just gonna sit in the chaos of that. That's fine. When am I teaching it again? I don't know. Watch this space.
How about
And
you, Becky?
you can find me. My website is yogaforneurodiversity.com, and I've got right now 3 regular offerings a month. There's a body doubling offering, so if people want to come and just
Woo!
practice yoga in community with others without any direct social interaction, that's really great. You can also fold laundry or take a nap or whatever. And then I do a yoga offering every month called Yoga for Unmasking, which is for anyone who's exploring their own neurodivergence, or maybe just whether or not like they are neurodivergent, to take a look at. And it's really everything that we do is neuroqueering, even though I might not use the word. And then I have a community connections group, which is a meetup group for people to connect with each other. We talk about, there's usually a topic, like this month, for example, is talking about neurodivergent burnout and how yoga can help. So those are the kinds of things that I have going on.
Well, thank you both for having this conversation. I think the title is going to be something like "Let's Get Weird."
Yay!
That's the takeaway. Let's get weird, friends. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah,
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for this conversation, actually series of conversations, Becky and Theo. Especially with this concept of neuroqueering, I have told so many people about it, and they were excited to learn and understand what that might mean for them and how they see the world. I just love it when we get to learn together. The things that are going to be on my train of thoughts over the next few weeks will definitely be in how we can get a little bit more weird in our lives and our teachings, and what does that mean to you as you think about getting a little weird in your classes and letting other people be weird with you. And I'm also going to be thinking about answering that question, why, when it comes up from clients and students. Do we have clear ideas of why we're doing or teaching things? Finally, if you want a space to synthesize what you listen to here and want more highlights and insights from the podcast, join the Backroom, a quieter, off-social media co-working space that I made for us on Patreon. We will be building our own careers together there and using what we learn online and in our earballs to figure out how to build the space and the yoga career of our dreams. Next week, we are taking the conversation abroad again to chat with folks in Australia and see how they see both yoga and yoga therapy work. I am so hungry for these conversations, and I am really looking forward to you hearing this chat. Now, let's go get to work. I'll catch you around the water cooler next time.